Good morning. I'm going to continue with my series looking at the first American Chess Congress. And we're in the final between Paul Morphy and Louis Paulsen. Morphy won the first game. The second game was a draw. And we're in the third game. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, and the quiet three knights opening. This can be tough to break down. It takes away attacking opportunities from the opponent. Bishop comes to c5 and the bishop comes to b5. Bishop to c4 and bishop to e2 are also acceptable moves. Pawn comes to d6 and the pawn comes to e4. d4 takes and takes. The knight is of course pinned, so he can't take. It loses the bishop. So the bishop comes to free the knight. The knight takes and the pawn takes. Giving himself double pawns, but giving himself a better grip on the d5 square. I think white should play the bishop to d3. I think it's out of position here and take some time to become more involved in the game. And queen to h4. I think here we can see, I haven't mentioned so far, but here we can see that it is definitely Morphy who is playing with the black pieces. Because he develops the queen and he threatens mate at the same time. Typical concentration on development and efficiency. So Paulsen develops and defends against the threat. Castling is a developing move, not just a defensive move. And the knight comes to f6 and develops with a threat on the pawn on e4. And the queen develops, defending the pawn on e4. And the knight comes to g4 to attack the h2 pawn and threaten mate there. But actually, just castling might have been a better move. And maybe castling and thinking, well, playing bishop to g4 would have been better. But he's threatening mate. Paulsen has to defend, and he does that by developing a piece. And this time it's Morphy who has gone against opening principles and moved the same piece for the second time in the opening. This piece. So, yeah. He now moves it for a third time. Is this even worse? Well, no, because this time he moves that piece with a tempo and he centralizes it. So we can't complain about that move. Queen comes to g3. Morphy, Paulsen is saying, yeah, I'm perfectly happy to swap queens and play in a fairly drawish looking endgame where you might have a slight positional disadvantage, but in which white is doing just fine. So the queen comes to f6. He doesn't want swap queens off. He wants to keep attacking possibilities open. That's Morphy. We can't really blame him for that, but I think just accepting that, you have to take the queens off and you're heading towards a drawish endgame is probably the right thing to do. The rook comes to a good position on the semi-open file, and this rook is defending the pawn on f2. So you would say apart from this bishop, everything is perfectly placed here. So h6, a reasonable move from Morphy. I think he's looking at the possibility of playing g4, chasing the bishop away, and renewing his threats on the f2 square. So king moves to h1, so the f pawn is now free to move. But it does take a defender away from the f2 pawn. Pawn comes to g5, and Paulsen takes the bishop, the knight with the bishop, giving up the 2 bishops, but really, realistically, putting an end to realistic attacking chances for black here. Takes the pawn. It takes with the pawn, sorry. And a lovely move by Paulsen. There's a real Morphy-like combination here. If he takes the bishop, then the rook will take the bishop, and the knight will come to b5, d5, threatening the queen and threatening the bishop, and taking advantage of the pin on the c6 pawn. The rest of how he wins, I'll leave you to work out for yourself. But Morphy sees through this, and maybe this is his first real evidence that he is playing against a sharp attacking player in Louis Paulsen. And the bishop retreats. Great move. The rook comes to f3, opening up 2 possibilities of the rook coming to f3 and threatening the queen, and of the other rook coming to d1 and doubling up. Yeah, pawn comes to h5, fair enough. Yeah, I'm not sure that castling into Paulsen's attack is the right idea here. So he does double the rooks. And the pawn comes to a6 to stop the pawn coming to b5 with good effect, because otherwise b5, pawn takes, knight takes, and Paulsen is then in a position to play knight takes bishop, and bishop takes knight, and swap off a large number of pieces and go more or less directly to a drawn ending. Morphy's aware of this and prevents that plan with a6, which gives good control over the b5 square. So that's good. The knight is now ready to rearrange itself to the kingside, and of course now the bishop can't move because the rooks are doubled, so it would be overwhelming on d7. So the rook comes to defend the d7 bishop to make it possible to move the dark square bishop. So Paulsen is forced into defending the b4 pawn. Knight comes to g4, maybe h4 might have been a little bit better. I think that's the case according to the engine. But the move g4 makes the game fairly even again now. And f5 makes it completely even. c4, sorry, makes it completely even. I think pushing the pawn here was the right idea to break open this queenside formation. Kingside formation. Queen comes to h6, good move. Bishop comes to... pawn comes to c5 and attacks the bishop. Seems like a really good move. It seems like it, really pushes home Paulsen's attacking advantage, but according to the engine, it's a bad move and it puts the position back to completely level. But Morphy, typical Morphy, attacks, and the queen comes to e3. Paulsen again is willing to swap off because he knows that this is an endgame which he can draw without much difficulty. Bishop comes to e7 to come out of the way. So, but also so that if Paulsen takes the queen, he's allowing Morphy to develop his last piece, which he doesn't want to do. But Paulsen plays f4, so that if he takes en passant, then his attack is definitely over when he's just left with this pawn. So Morphy takes with the e-pawn to maintain the attacking chances, but now Paulsen more or less forces the queens off. The queens are swapped off, and the attacking chances are extremely diminished now. Morphy plays his own rook left. Good idea. Might have been better to play h4 or g3. f5, definitely the wrong idea. I think he's in typical Morphy fashion, looking to break open lines. And so that if Morphy takes, then if Paulsen takes, then Morphy can play bishop takes here. Swap the rooks off. Good position. Attacking chances on the king side with these advanced pawns. But Paulsen just goes past. And now the threat of knight to f4 followed by pawn to e6 is extremely strong. And Morphy has to play rook to e6 immediately to prevent the pawn moving. But the knight comes and prevents the and chases the rook away. The rook takes the pawn, and now a Morphy-like combination. But from Paulsen, he takes with the rook has to take back, and the bishop takes the pawn, and the rook is pinned. So he's now threatening to play bishop takes pawn, and the bishop takes rook, and be a piece up. So Morphy puts the bishop in the way so that he doesn't. So that he's not losing a whole rook so easily. Obviously, the big threat, the big idea for Morphy is that if Paulsen takes on d6, he's going to get mated on the back rank. He takes on d6 with the pawn, leaves the rook where it is, and then the king comes to g1, so that he is now threatening to play rook takes pawn. The king comes to d8 to get the rook out of the pin, and the bishop takes the rook, and Paulsen is a whole piece up for a pawn. There's nothing to play for here for Morphy. It's game over. So, extremely well played attacking game by Morphy, and Paulsen has equalised the match in the final. Maybe you could wish that Morphy's efforts in the First American Congress didn't have the blemish of this loss, but it is good to see that when he was so far ahead of all his competitors, Morphy had anyway some decent opposition to meet. Players like Paulsen, probably one of the best players he met, Anderson, and Harvitz being the other really good players who Morphy had to meet. And it's also good to see that Morphy is only human. If the divine Paul Morphy can lose games, then I can forgive myself for the many games which I managed to lose. Yeah, okay. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.